As people are trickling in, I'm going to post the source sheet once or twice more in the chat for those of us who don't have it. And before we begin, I wanted to just acknowledge that the story that we're going to be learning together today is very disturbing and contains some really disturbing images, particularly as they relate to rape and sexual assault. And I just wanted to kind of acknowledge that and just say that these are very challenging topics, and I think it's a testament to how special the Tanakh is that it doesn't shy away from dealing with these topics. And we're going to think a lot about how this is portrayed in the text, and kind of what messages the text is trying to give us and the Tanakh is trying to give us about this story. That said, I think that this may have personal and painfully personal resonances for some or many of the people who are at this year or who are participating and listening. So I just want to just say that if at any point the conversation becomes difficult or upsetting for you, that's very understandable. Feel free to shut your video off, take a break, or just leave in a minute or two. Like, that's totally fine and understandable. And I just want to acknowledge, I want to ask that for everybody who participates too, as we speak about this very challenging and upsetting topic, that we all make sure to speak with real sensitivity and careful language, because we don't know necessarily who is sitting in this cheer with us, metaphysically speaking, and where people have been and where their experiences are. So I felt that it was important to begin with that, because we are learning perhaps one of the most upsetting, in my opinion, one of the most upsetting stories in Tanakh. And I just posted the source sheet. Some of you may have prepared it in advance, and if you didn't, I will just give you a super brief summary of this story. But essentially, David HaMelech has a son, his oldest son, whose name is Amnon. And he has another son named Avshalom, whose sister, so David's daughter, her name is Tamar. And Amnon essentially falls lustfully in love with his half-sister Tamar, and kind of schemes so that he gets himself alone with her, and he forcibly rapes her and then dismisses her, and in no way listens to her, how distraught she is. And he basically sends her away, which is a state for a woman at the time, which is just really not something one could recover from. That's the story that we're going to primarily be focusing on, although this story then leads to Tamar's brother Avshalom, her full brother Avshalom, seeking revenge on his half-brother Amnon, ultimately killing him, which leads Avshalom to have to flee for his life, and he kind of begins a rebellion against David HaMelech. And ultimately, this is really where we begin to see David HaMelech's family come apart. Not even at the seams, just like literally torn down the middle. And the story might be upsetting for a lot of reasons, but what I wanted to do before we begin is give everyone a chance to just share, if you prepared the story in advance, or if you've learned it before, or if you just listened to my synopsis just now, what are some questions that you have about this text? I know that's very broad, but I encourage you, if you feel more comfortable writing in the chat, to just take a minute and write your most burning question, something that bothers you about this, or something you want to know about this story. And I think if we start with everyone's questions, that might bring us together to a really interesting place to start. So I'm going to give everyone a second to type in the chat your questions about this story. Great. Thank you, Jonathan's iPad. David seems to side with Amnon and not Tamar. So that's something we're going to have to take a look at in this text of David's reaction. It definitely falls short of what maybe we would have hoped. And we're bothered about why he doesn't chastise Amnon at all about for his behavior. Chastise is even maybe for some of us too weak of a word, right? Maybe he deserves a little bit more than some chastisement, right? And where is David HaMelech's reaction? Amazing. So Ellie, I've always wondered about the father's influence. Great, right? We're bothered. We expect that heroes in our story, right, David HaMelech, should have a positive influence on their child. And when a child acts in such an upsetting way, we wonder what role the parents either should have had or could have had or maybe did have in the child's behavior. So Ellie points out maybe he was too busy being king and fighting wars to have the right kind of influence on his children. Ultimately, we're going to examine those assumptions together. Amazing questions. Yael, how does Avshalom guess that Amnon raped Tamar? Does it have anything to do with the fact that Amnon's clever advisor seems to be pro Avshalom? Excellent. So there is definitely a lot of intrigue. We're going to see that Avshalom kind of realizes what's up with Tamar as soon as he sees her. How did he know? Is there a background story? And what is up with this advisor to Amnon who basically encourages Amnon to rape his sister? Maybe it's against multiple wives and households. Amazing. I'm going to take, if anybody has some more questions, I'm waiting for maybe one or two more. I'll give you another second to write. Great question. Yeah, right. What happened to Tamar? I think in a lot of these stories, we get very caught up, as the text does, in the political implications and the religious implications. Those are sphere. Those are the men's sphere. We focus on the fact that man kills his brother, and sometimes we lose sight of the fact that really this is a story about a woman, and we wonder what happens to her. And so we're going to have to take a look at the end of the story very closely to see how Tamar ends up. And this isn't the first time we've seen the name Tamar. That can't be coincidental. Excellent. Tamar reminds us of another woman named Tamar in Genesis and Bereshit. And that Tamar also had a very complicated and a little bit suspicious looking, strange looking sexual history. We're going to think about that a little bit together. And great question, Marilyn. It's an interesting question. You're asking about the laws about rape. What's fascinating here is this story is not a legal story, right? This isn't like where we learn laws about what happens to a woman who is raped. There are texts about that in the Chumash, which are more legal sections. But I think you're asking a great question, because we're going to see that even within our text, there seems to be a certain kind of societal norm or law relating to rape that seems to be shared by people in the story, and we're going to touch on those as well. Amazing questions. Keep them coming if you'd like. We're gonna take now a look at the text together and hopefully answer some of these questions and glean a little bit of insight. So a technique that I often use is literary analysis of the story. The text is written, this story is written in a very artful way, such that it's not just really telling us this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened. From the details of the way this text is written in the Navi, it actually is trying to tell us more than just fact. Good, so Ellie exactly is leading into this question. It's not here to just tell us a story, right? There's a role that this narrative plays in the larger story of David HaMelech, in teaching us something about the way we treat and listen to individuals. And we are going to draw that out by looking very carefully at the way the text is written. So we're going to look at titles and names, the attributions people have. Very rarely in this story is somebody just called by their name. They're oftentimes given a title or spoken about in a familial relation. And those things are going to be that detail is going to be very important to us. We're also going to look at repetition, ideas that show up over and over again, imagery, ways that characters are displayed, or symbols where something shows up and it plays a role in the story, but really it's hinting that it might mean something else. And finally, allusion. There are a few stories from the Chumash that this story is written to sound a lot like. It's supposed to remind us of things from Chumash when we read it. And we're going to try to think about why the text is written in such a way as to remind us of those particular stories. How is our understanding of this story of Amnon and Tamar changed by in connect with a different story? So those are going to be the big questions we're trying to, the method we are using, and ultimately we're going to try to answer these questions and make sense of this very challenging and painful story. So let's turn to our source sheet. I'm going to share it one more time in the chat for those of us who would like it. Excellent. So our story begins with a somewhat innocuous opening line. The story opens and it says, "Vayehi acharei Cain." And it was after this thing happened, which is a pretty normal way to begin a story, right? And then, except what it implies often, "Vayehi acharei Cain," it was after this, that there's some connection between this narrative and the preceding narrative. And so all of you last week studied the preceding narrative. What's the preceding narrative? I'm testing to make sure everyone's awake. What was the story that happened immediately before this one? Another famous, challenging, troublesome story in our Tanakh.
Michal berates David for dancing in front of all the people.
That was the last one we did. That was the last story that I taught here, but immediately in Shmuel chapter 12, Rabbi Buchler taught it last week, also right. With David and another one. David and Bathsheba. Okay, so immediately before this is the story of David HaMelech seeing a woman bathing on the roof, in the words of the song, right? And he finds her beautiful and he takes her and has sex with her, and she becomes pregnant, and then he has to kill her husband to cover up the fact that, you know, he impregnated her, and then that goes awry, and Hashem, you know, sends Natan HaNavi to punish David HaMelech, to send the message of rebuke, and ultimately David HaMelech is punished in a very complex and challenging narrative, and then punishment by Natan HaNavi, and we are curious to know what the connection between these two stories is. Now, on the most basic pshat level, one of the punishments that David gets is that his family will experience serious unrest. And the way that begins is with the very sad death of the child, Bathsheba's child that she has with David HaMelech. That child dies, and that is fated, says the punishment, to continue with other of David's children. There are also going to die. So on the surface level, this story is a connection because it leads to the death of Amnon. And later, it leads to then ultimately the death of Avshalom as well. So in some ways, we can see this story as kind of a fulfillment of the prophecy that was given to David. But what we are going to ask ourselves is there a deeper relationship between this narrative and the story of David and Bathsheba, and what happens with David and Bathsheba? So let's leave that question at the back of our minds. And we see Vayehi acharei Cain. And it was after this, we find out that Avshalom ben David, Avshalom, the son of David, had a beautiful sister, had an achot yafa, a beautiful sister, and her name was Tamar. Vaya'aveha, and someone loved her. Who loved her? Amnon ben David. Amnon, the son of David. Now, this verse is written in a way that is supposed to leave us with one major conclusion, which is like, this is a bad situation. And the way it does that is syntactically, it leaves the surprise till the end. And we're going to see there's another pasuk that does that as well. But if this was your first time hearing the story, you would hear Avshalom, the son of David, had a beautiful sister named Tamar, and someone loved her. Who loved her? Amnon, who's also the son of David, her half brother. Wait, right? So already this text leaves this last detail of the Ben David till the end so that we can recognize immediately that this is going to be a incestuous story, right? This attraction between half siblings is supposed to perturb us. And additionally, we're also seeing that the story is framed. It doesn't say, and there was a beautiful girl named Tamar, and Amnon loved her. This is really ultimately about Avshalom and Amnon, which already is tipping us off to the fact that there's going to be also fratricide, right? A brother killing a brother. So from the beginning of this story, we're already seeing seeds of the fact from the way this verse is written that there is a lot going on here, and it's supposed to be something that we find disturbing. One other thing that's very interesting about this verse is that it uses the word vaye'ahaveha, and he loved her. And for those of us who were here with me when I taught the story about Michal, I know that Rona was, when we did the story about Michal, the verb of love is a very important word in the story of David. We talked about how everybody who meets David falls like instantly in love with him. And everyone loves him. Michal loves him, Shaul loves him, Jonathan loves him, all the people love him. But we actually never see anywhere, right, in this text that David loves someone else. All of the love is headed towards David and not given forward by David. And when we see here that there's love between Amnon and his sister, we're maybe supposed to be reminded in some way of the way that love feeds into the David narrative. I love, Miriam, what you just pointed out, that she's identified as Avshalom's sister instead of David's daughter, right? She's Achot Avshalom and not Bat David. Everybody else in the text is Ben David, which is really interesting, and I think is going to become very important when we see the way that David ultimately actually participates in what ends up happening to Tamar, which is a very disturbing fact, and may also play into the way that we think about the worth of daughters and how people see sisters and where we attribute identity of women in this story. So that's just our first verse. But we have the verse opens in a very strong and powerful way. And we find out, the next line tells us, Vayitzer la'amnon lehitchalot ba'avor Tamar achoto. And Amnon he's so upset that he becomes sick because of his sister Tamar. Now, this text is not cutting us any slack. We know exactly who Tamar is. We didn't need to remind us right here that it's Achoto, that it's his sister. We knew that already. The text is anyways reminding us in the context of his feelings for her. It's not letting us forget that this relationship is deeply problematic. And it's interesting because the reason why, right, the reason that the text tells us why Amnon was so into her was ki betulahi, because she was a virgin. That there was something, what is it about virginity that's so kind of attractive in like a maybe Freudian, I don't know enough about Freud to know that it's for sure Freudian, but in some kind of like psychological sense, the idea is that it's untouchable. Right? Virginity is an untouchable person, right? Somebody who's a virgin is untouchable. They've never been with anybody. And there's something elusive about that. And we're going to see how that comes up once Amnon actually accesses her, right? The thing that he wants about her and that he appreciates so much is her virginity, is the fact that she's inaccessible to him, not just because she's his half sister, but also because she is a virgin. And for that reason, Amnon is like, there's no way that I'm going to be able to literally to do anything with her. And actually, the crassness of the language, that is not a normal way that the Tanakh talks about sexual attraction or love or marriage or sexual, like any kind of sexual encounter. This is a rare phrase, and it's very carnal. It's right, lasot ba me'uma. He wants to do something to her, right? It's the language is very objectifying and speaks to the fact that is why she feels so beyond him. It's not the moral, ethical, right, that she's his sister, kind of like the cult, right, that it's more that because she's untouchable, he can't touch her. And that is that makes him so upset that he becomes visibly perturbed. And Yonadav, who his advisor, his Reya, sees how upset he is. And when we meet this advisor, who some of us have asked about, what is immediately striking is this continues to remain in the family. Who is this advisor? He's actually the brother of David. He's Amnon's uncle. He's Tamar's uncle, right? And this is the advisor who we find out is Ish Hacham Me'od. He's very, very smart. And he is going to be the one who devises the plan that by which Amnon is going to be able to get Tamar alone and act against her and violate her. And he says to Amnon, his uncle Yonadav says to him, Vayomer lo, Madua ata kacha dal, right? Why are you so kind of weak or poorly? And what does he call him? Ben Hamelech. Ben Hamelech, the son of the king, is weak. He's low. You look very down. You just don't look great. Boker ba boker, every single morning. Halo tagidli, why don't you tell me what's going on? And within this, within his question, he calls Amnon Ben Melech, right? We've seen him called many things up until now, but what is he trying to say when he calls him Ben Melech? He's saying, you're the son of the king. You shouldn't be sad. Whatever's making you sad, we can fix. This language is a serious language of entitlement, right? That what he's basically saying to him is, since you're the son of the king, whatever's making you sad should be able to be in your grasp. And this is very striking because this is the assumption with which Yonadav approaches Amnon, and Amnon seems to agree with, right? And it's this kind of entitlement and literally privilege, right? This idea that that because I am the son of the king, then I should be able to make myself feel better, is inherently part of what is so sick and twisted about this, because it leads him, as we're going to see, to think he's allowed to do whatever it is he wants. And with that approach, and not even so much convincing, Amnon reveals in that same syntactically brilliant way what it is that he wants. Amnon says to him, Et Tamar, achot Avshalom, achi ani ohev. Right? It's right, Tamar, the sister of Avshalom, my brother. So by the way, we are again in we know exactly who Tamar is, and he needs to talk about her in the most kind of twisted familial relationship way possible to remind us how related they are. He's clearly aware of that because that's how he introduces her. And then he leaves his feelings for her for last, right? And so we're listening, and he says, all right, it's Tamar, my brother, I love her, right? It pulls us along in this story. And it's interesting, a biblical commentator pointed out that if you listen to the words of Amnon here, it has but it has a striking alliteration. He says, Tamar achot Avshalom achi ani ohev. That it's this sighing, like this lovesick noise that keeps coming out of his mouth, which speaks to kind of the way he's feeling. And when you read it in the Hebrew, you can kind of see that sighing, obsessive tone, which becomes increasingly disturbing when you hear what it is that he's saying. And so he confesses his feelings to this advisor. And Yonadav has an idea for him. He says to him, why don't you lay down in your bed? You're already sick. Lay down and pretend to be even more sick, I guess, right? And when your father, Avicha, right, and now he's not Melech anymore, right? In the line before, when it's talking about privilege, he was right. He was talking about David as Melech. Now David is Avicha, your father. There's a familial emphasis here. When your father comes to see you, say to him, please, right now is this respectful word. Please let Tamar, my sister, come to me and nourish me with food. She'll make me feel better. Let her prepare the food before my eyes so I can see it and I will eat it from her. Now, this suggestion on the part of Yonadav has within it a very clear kind of allusion to what Amnon really wants. There's a strong emphasis here on sight, right? He knows he wants Amnon to come prepare the dish before him. He's supposed to watch her make whatever food for him so that he can be appetized, right? And this euphemism, there is a euphemism common in rabbinics and in biblical literature that food is equated in some ways with sex. And this idea that she's going to stand in front of him and prepare food for him is kind of supposed to be some like arousing in some way. And this is the suggestion that we make. And there's a sense here actually that this emphasis on him watching her is pretty obviously even a little weird. And so when Amnon actually relays this request to David HaMelech, he cuts out one of these words that are the sight words, because he has a sensitivity to the idea that it maybe is a little weird that he's asking for his sister to stand there while he could watch her. And so what happens? Vayishkav Amnon, he listens. He does exactly what Yonadav tells him. He lays down and he pretends to be sick. Vayavo HaMelech, and who comes? Not Avicha, not the father, not your father, David, your father. David the king shows up, and he shows up to see his son. And Amnon says El HaMelech to the king, not to his father. It's right. He's speaking now to the king, which I think makes us question when we see how Amnon is speaking and relating to him. How does Amnon see his father? Right? While Yonadav is saying, oh, he's your father, is that really the way that Amnon is relating to him? Because in the text where Amnon relates directly with David, Amnon is referring to him as king, which perhaps implies some kind of distance, which fits interestingly with the point that we raised at the beginning about the love of David. That David HaMelech, people loved him, but he was not so clearly generous with genuine love towards the people around him. And one wonders, like what Ellie raised at the beginning, of what it was like to be the child of David. What were the love experiences that Amnon, as a child of David, saw in the house around him? It seems like the relationship here he has with his father is quite cold, and the love he does show doesn't seem to hit the mark in the way most of us would have hoped. So it calls into question, I think, the broader emotional relationship between David and his children. So we see that David HaMelech comes, and Amnon speaks to him, and he says, Tavo na Tamar achoti, let please Tamar, my sister, come. Now let's pay careful attention to who says please to who and for what purposes. But we have here Amnon asking respectfully, his father, the king, for his sister to come. And what does he want her to do? V'tila bev le'enai, right, le'enai, shtei levivot. And she should prepare these, and this is a very weird word. It seems to be some kind of cake that she should knead or prepare, some kind of cake for him in front of his eyes. And it's, I think, no coincidence that these words sound like lave, like heart. Right? He's lovesick. He wants her to make little heart. Some translations actually say that these heart-shaped cakes, right? That there's some kind of like lustful, emotional love overtones here, even though he tones down the emphasis. He just says Le'enai once as opposed to Yonadav, which kind of emphasized sight twice. There's some kind of connotation here of the heart. And what happens? Vayishlach David et Tamar. I think it's very interesting to note that here he's called David. He's just himself. That in this moment when he unknowingly acquiesces to the demise of his daughter and two of his sons, he essentially kind of hands his own daughter over to his other son. He's himself. He's not a father. He's not a king. And it really, again, for a brief moment, makes us wonder, who is David? And this is a question that has haunted us since we started learning about David from the very beginning. Who really is he? Is he a father? Is he a warrior? Is he loyal to God? Is he a sinner? Is he a king? There's a lot of layers to David HaMelech, and here he's just acting as himself. And it is in this action where he acquiesces to Amar and ultimately does something quite horrific. And what does he do? He sends a message to Tamar, Habaita. Where is Tamar? Tamar is at home. Tamar is exactly where Tamar belongs. She's doing the right thing, right? She's where a woman in her station and stature is supposed to be. She's in her house. She's not a woman who's out there in the streets, right? Like, there's nothing that she's doing which would give us any indication that she's anything other than a modest, loyal, wonderful daughter. And he sends a message to her in her home, and he says, Lechina, please, right? He's now asking her, please go to the house, Beit Amnon Achicha, leave your house and go to the house of Amnon, your brother, and make him some food. Now, it's very obvious and interesting to note that when David relays the request, he doesn't really include any of this looking at, let me look at you while you do it, and I want you to make these heart-shaped cakes. None of that makes it into the request. And I think that's pretty telling about maybe what felt a little weird about Amnon's initial request. David kind of cuts it out, and yet he requests that Tamar kind of goes to Amnon. And she does. Vatelech Tamar Beit Amnon Achiha. And she goes and she leaves her house. She leaves her place of safety, her home, and she enters the home where danger is lurking for her. She enters the home of Amnon, her brother. Not once, by the way, did the text let us forget that they are siblings, right? V'hu shochev, he's laying down. And she takes the dough and she kneads it. Vatilabev le'enav. She's making these heart-shaped cakes, or she's making this delicacy in front of him. And she cooks these cakes also in front of him. And we're supposed to already get maybe a little heebie-jeebie about this. And it continues to kind of get worse. And the text tells us, she takes the cake and she sets it before him. She does exactly what she's supposed to do. She's servicing him, but he refuses to eat it. And so what does he do? He kind of makes it seem like it's because, everyone's watching. There's too many people around. He needs privacy. He's not feeling well. He needs to eat on his own. And so he sends everybody out of the room. He says with a very striking phrase, he says, Hotziu kol ish me'alai. Get everyone out of here. And everyone leaves, and we find Tamar alone with Amnon. Now that phrase is supposed to be very striking for us. Does it remind anyone? Does anyone know where that phrase comes from? Hotziu kol ish me'alai. It's a hard one. It's from the story of
Yosef.
Yeah, 3 people at once. That was great. It's from the story of Yosef. At the very end of the story of Yosef, when the brothers are standing before him and they're kind of saying, like, no, we can't do this. We had right. They're telling they're really basically apologizing, and Yosef can't keep it in anymore. He sends away all of the courtiers that are around him. He says, Hotziu kol ish me'alai, I need to be alone with my brothers. And this is supposed to be for us a very jarring moment, because it reminds us of a very similar situation in which we have a sibling sending everyone away so that they could be alone with their sibling. The text is playing on the familial relationship between the two of them, which is acknowledging the taboo. But what here is so tragic is that the result is the opposite. That in the story of Yosef, this is the moment of reconciliation from the attempt at fratricide, right? You tried to kill me, or there was this like tension between us, and I'm now going to reconcile it. And in this story, this is the moment where there's a total violation of sibling relationship, both towards Tamar, and this leads to the actual successful fratricide of Avshalom killing Amnon. And that phrase is supposed to be so jarring for us when he says, everyone get out, and everyone leaves. And now we see that not only is that is not enough for Amnon, because Amnon says to Tamar, bring this nourishment, bring this food you made into my chamber, into my even more private bedroom, so that I may be nourished from your hand, basically, so that you can feed me. And Tamar does this. She takes the cakes that she makes and she brings them with Amnon, her brother, into the chamber. And what you can already begin to see here is there is a tightening of space around Tamar. She comes from her home where she belongs and she is safe. She goes into the home of someone else, right? The home of her brother, where she is with him. Everyone gets sent away. She's alone, and now she's moving even farther in into his bedroom. And this is this constricting of space we are supposed to experience as readers as a sense of being constricted as well. And so what happens? They go into the room together, and this is kind of the culminating moment, the culminating scene of this story. And she brings him the food, and what does the text tell us? Vayachazek ba, he grabs her. Vayomer la, he says to her, Boi shechvi imi achoti. Right? Come, lie with me, my sister. Right? He literally says it, right? He needs to include achoti. He knows what's happening. He knows exactly what's happening. And he says, come, lie with me, my sister. And Tamar's reaction, right, we're supposed to have a reaction of aversion, of like, achoti, like what? No, don't do that. And also, right, there's also definitely a coercion piece here that's very uncomfortable. And Tamar's reaction is consistent with ours. She says, lo, right, but Tamar, lo, she says to him, al achi, my brother, you're my brother, don't do this. Al ta'aneni, don't. It's a hard word to translate because it has a lot of connotations, but it essentially means do not rape, abuse, or force me in this way. Ki lo ya'asechen b'Yisrael. This is not something that we do in Israel. Al ta'ase et hanivala hazo. Don't do this disgusting, horrible thing. Now, this is where we begin to see some of the social taboos that are already in place in Israel. It seems that there's some kind of law or custom where everyone's kind of aware, this is not how we behave. There's a lot happening in this story that is wrong. There's incest, there's extramarital coercive sex, right? These are not things that are done either legally or socially. It's an interesting thing because this phrase should be very familiar to us from another story in Breshit. If you take a look on the third page of your, the second page, what is this page? Third page of your source sheet, we see that these words show up in another story of rape. We have the story of the rape of Dinah. And in the story of the rape of Dinah in Genesis 34, when Yaakov's sons, when the brothers, right? Again, we have a story of brothers and their sister who's raped, and the reactions here are clearly quite difficult, quite different. The brothers are furious that their sister has been raped. They're very, very angry because ki nivala asa b'Yisrael, it's the same word, a disgusting, horrible thing had happened in the family of Israel. Lishkav et bat Yaakov v'chein lo ye'aseh. This is not what's done, right? And so the fact that we have the word nivala and v'chein lo ye'aseh is supposed to resonate with exactly what it is that Tamar is saying to Amnon. Like, lo ya'asechen b'Yisrael, we don't do this. This is a nivala. Please don't do this thing. And she continues, and she says to him, where am I supposed to take my shame? And you, she says to him, are going to be like Achad HaNivalim BeYisrael. She combines, she says, don't do this thing. And she recombines those words in a fascinating literary move where she says, you are going to become seen as a disgusting person. And so please, the bear na, please, right? Her na, everyone else's nas were about her. And now she's pleading. She's saying, please go speak El Hamelech to the king, right? To David. She calls him a king, not my father, right? Go to the king because he'll let you, he will let you have me. So this is a very interesting question about whether or not that is the case, right? Whether or not he would or not. It seems like she's definitely trying to get out of the situation that she is in. And it's interesting. Jonathan points out to us that in the story of the rape of Dinah, which this is an allusion to, Yaakov's reaction is no better than David's. In fact, it's actually the very same reaction. In the story of the rape of Dinah, how does the story end? Yaakov does nothing, right? Yaakov doesn't speak. He stays quiet in the face of, does not answer the challenge that is put forward to him. And as we will see, the similar thing happens here. David will remain quiet. So Jonathan, thank you for pointing that out. And so in this moment, it's very clear that her kind of response and reaction is quite flustered. I want to point out one other allusion before we get to Amnon's reaction. This story is very similar to another part of the Yosef story. That part of the Yosef story is also on page 3 at the bottom. It's the story of Yosef and Bat Potiphar, and Eshet Potiphar. And so the first thing we find out about Yosef in this story is it says, "Vayihi Yosef yafet to'ar v'yafeh mar'eh." He's beautiful, just like Tamar is beautiful. And he goes, right, and it was after these things, and the wife of his master lifted her eyes, asa'et eina, he's looking at her, just like Amnon was looking, and she says, Shechva imi, which is exactly what Amnon says as well, Shechva imi. It's that same demanding language. In this instance, Yosef refuses, and the language he uses to refuse and the way he speaks is actually very, very reminiscent of the way Tamar speaks. He gives all these reasons. No, I definitely can't do this. How could I, right? There's all these reasons why this is such a bad idea. But then the text also reminds us of the role that the house plays. And it says, this idea that nobody's there, nobody's in the house, and the empty house being a dangerous place for these kinds of events. And so we see another allusion here to the Yosef story. So let's put that in the back of our minds because this is all going to weave together in a moment. The story of Dinah, the perpetrator is outside. Yes, that's a very good point, Miriam, right? In the story of Dinah, it's external. So this reminds us of the story of Dinah, but it's pretty clear to us that in a lot of ways, this is actually much worse. In the story of Dinah, it wasn't an incestuous relationship. And we see, and there's conversation there about him trying to marry her, at least making an attempt to marry her. And we're going to see that does not show up in the story of Amnon. So in many ways, the story is actually much worse. And so now we arrive at Amnon's response. She's pleading him. She's saying, I don't want to. Please don't do this thing. And what is Amnon's response? V'lo ava lishmoa bekola. He doesn't, I couldn't translate this in any way. It's a fancy thing. He doesn't want to listen to her, but it's not just that he doesn't want to, it's that he doesn't deign to listen, which has a different connotation. V'lo ava, he didn't desire to listen to what it is that she had to say. And that kind of language is indicative in another way of the privilege that Amnon and the power that Amnon had in this interaction. He didn't need to listen to her, and so he didn't want to, and so he didn't. And when in him not listening to her, what does he do? He overpowers her. He's stronger than her. He forced, abused her, he raped her, and he laid her. And so the fact that we have these three verbs in quick succession with each other is a way that the text oftentimes talks about something that happens very, very quickly with haste and aggression. And that's very much the case here. And the text tells us immediately afterwards, Amnon, he hates her. Right? In direct contrast with the opening that he loved her, immediately after he hates her, sin'a gdola me'od, with a very intense hatred. Ki gadol hasin'a asher sne'a me'ava asher aheva. And he hated her more than he had originally loved her. And this is a very, very deep psychological insight. It's from, in Pirkei Avot, it talks about ahava tluya b'davar, love that's dependent on an external thing. And in this story, it's very clear that once that thing is gone, the love is gone, and it's actually replaced with hate. And it's very clear from this story that it's not hate that he has towards Tamar. It's this recognition, right? Being able to see with clear eyes of what he had done. And there's this hate that's directed at her that's, I would like to psychoanalytically suggest, is very much actually directed at himself. And that transformation and reversal of the way that he was feeling, that hatred is burns in him and eats him up. And it's interesting because the thing that had originally attracted him to her, what was that love based on? That she was a betulah, that she was a virgin, she was untouchable, he couldn't have her, he would never be allowed to have her. And as soon as he had her, that thing that he was attracted to had absolutely vanished. And there was only that loathing, that self-loathing that was kind of directed at her, that was left. And so what's his reaction? He says to her, "Vayomer la Amnon, kumi lechi," get up and leave. And that is a particularly obnoxious, like literally get up and get out, right? That's a very harsh way of speaking. And it's supposed to be a very clear reversal from the way he had originally spoken to her. The first words he says to her is, "Bo'i shichvi," come lay down. And now he says, "Kumi," get up, "lechi," get out, right? He had drawn her into this inner circle of space, and now he's pushing her out. He wants her to leave. And Tamar's reaction is, Vayomer lo, right? She says to him, don't, and it's actually very hard Hebrew to translate. It's very possible that she herself was speaking in a way that was discombobulated, and she says, "Don't do hara'ah hagdolah hazot me'acheret asher asita." She uses that same language. He hates her with a hatred that is even greater, and she says, "If you kick me out because of this, you are doing an even worse thing than what you originally did to send me away." L'shalcheni. This probably has the connotation of not just physically sending her away, but is the word used for divorce. Now, in biblical times, and we have to understand the societal context here, that part of what was so horrible for her was that she then had absolutely no prospect of getting married. And the halacha, the law in Jewish law, is if a woman is raped and she desires to stay with and be married to the man who raped her, which is honestly a situation that I think we would all really struggle to understand in a modern society, but makes sense because then it forces her to have a marriage contract where she's going to be in a social structure that's going to protect her. He has to do it. And so she's saying, not only did you rape me, you're now going to send me away and leave me without prospects. She wants to have some kind of protection. And so she begs him and she says, "Please, this would be even worse than the original thing you did." And how does this conclude? V'lo ava lishmo bekola. He doesn't deign to listen to her. Just like he didn't listen to her pleas to stop, he doesn't listen to her pleas to keep her. And it really underlines and heightens him not desiring to listen to her voice, coming out of a place of really of his privilege. And what does he do? She's there, and he calls his na'ar, his servant, and he says to him, "Shilchu na, please," right? He asks a kindly request of his servant, "Send away at zot, this thing." Right? The way that he even refers to her is degrading and continues to be objectifying. And he says, "Get her out of here." And the words he uses are a reversal of his original technique of trying to get her in, come to my house, come to my chamber. Now he says, "Shilchu, send her away, me'alai, from me, hachutza, send her outside, une'al hadelet achareha, and lock her out get her away from me, push her out." Right? So we have this bringing her in, and then now that he's done with her, he pushes her out. And this is it, right? And this is what happens. But the text tells us one more fascinating detail about her. The Aleha, and what was she wearing? Ketonet pasim, a coat of many colors. This should again bring us right back to the story of Yosef. It shows up, this Ketonet Pasim shows up exactly 2 times in the whole Tanakh. Yosef has one and Tamar has one. She has this Ketonet Pasim, and we find out that what is it? It is a special robe that Benot HaMelech HaBetulot, the most honorable girls, the daughters of the king, would wear, and that's what she was wearing on her. And when the servant, and that was what she was wearing when the servant kicked her out and locks the door behind her. And we find out very painfully that what does she do? Vatikach Tamar afar al rosha. She takes ashes on her head in mourning, and she takes her ketonet hapasim that was on her, and she tears it. She puts her hands on her head and she walks around screaming. Now, this is a very jarring image of a woman calling out. She's clearly in pain, in very deep pain, and she goes around. She goes out, and it's interesting because when we think about the Ketonet Pasim of Yosef, the Ketonet Pasim of Yosef was also torn. The brothers take it off of him, they tear it, and they dip it in blood to convince their father that he was dead. If we think about the situation Tamar was in, she tore her cloak, and it is also very likely that her cloak had blood on it as well, as she was wearing it as she lost her virginity. And this image is supposed to stick with us, because it was a sign of Yosef, right? This is how they tried to show that Yosef was dead, and Tamar herself feels dead. She herself feels that she's tearing her cloak. She's in mourning, and she's clearly distraught as she approaches her brother. Her brother will find her. And I want to just quickly pause here to really draw a conclusion, or perhaps suggest a conclusion here. We see, first of all, about the death in the Midrash. It's actually quoted in Gemara Yoma that because of of the sin that David did with Bathsheba, he is to lose Arbatayim, right? 40, but he loses 4 children. And the Midrash says Yeled, it's the son from the union of David and Bathsheba, and Amnon, and Avshalom, and the 4th child is Tamar. Tamar doesn't physically die at the end of this story, but this imagery of her tearing the cloak, of her in mourning, and the experience that she had is equivalent to her death, and that is the way she reacts to it, and that's the way the Midrash treats it, and it is a very, very grave matter. And what's interesting as well about these allusions to Yosef is our story began with an allusion to the end of Yosef, of revealing his presence to his brothers. In the middle, we had an allusion to the incident of Yosef and Eshet Potiphar, and at the end, we have an allusion to the Ketonet Pasim. What we see here is actually an inversion of the story of Yosef. All of these allusions are actually backwards. They happen in the reverse order. And it perhaps suggests to us, right, that while the story of Yosef is actually a story of healing, of something wrong happening and an experience gone through, and we ultimately arrive at a reconciliation, this story is a story of disintegration, where we have flipped on its head the story of Yosef, and we end in the exact horrible place where the Yosef story had started. And so we have Tamar wandering through the streets, clearly bereft, besides herself. Za'akashi, her voice is calling out. And then we see Amnon. Amnon appears on the scene. Sorry, Avshalom. Avshalom appears on the scene, and Avshalom finds her, and he says, Avshalom, her brother, reminds us, finds her, and he says, Amnon achicha haya imach? Has Amnon, your brother, been with you? Right? It's very possible that he here is speaking quite delicately, but he recognizes what Amnon did. And what does he say to her? Ata achoti hacharishi. Be quiet. And this, to me, is honestly, it gives me chills when I think about it. This is one of the most upsetting 2 words of this whole story. That when we see Tamar in this story, all she has is her voice. In the beginning, she pleads with him, and we find out that, right, she raises her voice, and we find out that Amnon lo shama bekola, he doesn't listen to her voice, twice, right? And then she goes around and she's screaming, she's really, really bereft. And what is she told? That she needs to be quiet. And it's incomparable to the way in which Amnon exists in this story as somebody who gets to decide whatever he wants. He's driven by his eyes, right? He gets to see whatever he looks at. He's looking at things and they become his, and he desires them and he wants them and he goes after them. While Amnon has sight, Tamar is wholly associated with her voice, and it is that exact aspect of her that Amnon disregards and that her brother Avshalom negates. And he tells her to be quiet. And what does he do? He says, be quiet. He's your brother. It's a very hard thing to understand exactly. Achichahu, he's your brother. Do not take this thing to heart. Al tasiti et libech ledavar hazeh. Don't let your heart pay attention to this. Now that is like the least understanding and helpful thing anybody can say. What does that mean? Don't let your heart pay attention. Again, we see her heart is here at play. And it's a very painful reaction on the part of Avshalom. And it's hard to know exactly what it is that he meant. He's telling her to be quiet. You can't do anything about it, especially because we're going to see that 2 years later, we find out that he never forget what happened to her, and he does something about it and he acts. And so it could be he's just telling her, be quiet for now. We're going to take care of this in the long run. But there doesn't seem to be an indication of that. To be telling her, you get over this. And he doesn't himself have to, get over. He's going to put this inside his own heart and guard it for years until it leads him to kill his brother. And what does he do to her? What does Avshalom do? The text tells us, Vateshev Tamar shmema. She sits shamem, like desolate. Beit Avshalom Achicha, in the house of Avshalom, her brother, that we find her again in a new house. Where is she? She's in the house of her brother. So Avshalom took her in. She could never be married again. She can't return to her father's house. So she lives in the house of her brother, desolate for the rest of her days. And that is the last that we hear about her. She is literally silenced from the story. She's put away. And where else do we find silence? But in this case, it seems to be intentional and not forced. The Hamelech David, King David, right? Not Father David, King David, hears all of these things. Vayichar lo me'od, and he is very angry. But the text doesn't seem to say exactly what he's angry about, and he never actually does anything. And the last relationship we find out is that Avshalom doesn't speak to Amnon for any matter. They just don't talk, because Avshalom hates Amnon because of what he had done to his sister. And I'm aware of the time, so I wanna try to wrap up. But this ending of silence on everyone's part, right? Everyone chooses to not talk about what happened until it boils through, and then it leads to, right, the killing that's going to happen, which we're not gonna have time to take a look at. It's on the next page if you'd like to read the rest of the story. But that silence is quite troubling and reminds us of Yaakov's silence in the eyes of in sight of what happened with Dinah. And I think that that the theme of silence in this story is incredibly striking. That we have Tamar, who wants to be heard and wants to speak, and she is silenced, and the men around her, her father and her brothers, don't speak and don't communicate with each other about what it is that happened. This story is pretty horrible. It was very sad. I want to take one moment to just tie together some of the points that we made, which will maybe give us a little bit of sense about what we're supposed to take away from this story. Ellie, I think you're right. This is a very troubling story from the perspective of like seeing the way that she's treated, for sure. I want to go back to our original question, which is Vayihi achar Cain. It was after these things. And what is the relationship between this story and the story of David and Bathsheba? And I'd like to suggest that it's more than just a fulfillment of the promise of what happened to him, right? That promise could have been fulfilled in a multitude of ways. And I think that this story is actually pretty reminiscent of what David himself did with Bathsheba. David was home. The text tells us that he was home at the season when everybody else was at war. Amnon too is lazing around his house, right? He's kind of there and lovesick and sees and is attracted to somebody he can't have. David was not allowed to have Bathsheba. Amnon was not allowed to have Tamar. And they both utilize their privilege and position in order to get the woman that they wanted. And I think that's really telling, because this tearing apart of David's family isn't just the way it happens is not just a coincidence. Amnon is acting in some ways very similar to the way his own father acted. He's confused about the way to love, the way David is also confused about the way to love. And he acts towards the woman who's the object of his desire in the same way, or in the similar way, that David acted towards Bathsheba. And ultimately, this story really is a downfall. It's the inversion of the Yosef story, in which instead of a prince or a princess, right, being kind of like finding healing and forgiveness within their family, and kind of rising above the negative feelings between siblings, we see the inversion of that, and we see the familial relationship disintegrate. And it really does leave us in this very sad and painful place, which will ultimately lead to Avshalom killing Amnon, and David's army killing his own son, which is really, really quite painful. And I think really, when I think about this takeaway, I think it really speaks very strikingly to the ways in which children do react to their parents. I think the issue here was not that David wasn't home, right, that he was away fighting wars, but that there seems to have been a lack of modeling of love and appropriate kind of like behaviors on the part, right, that where Amnon obviously took it too far and did the wrong thing, and this is definitely, you know, his fault and his responsibility. But when we think about the punishment that was wrought on the people around David, it's not just the divine hand acting and striking down people at random, but it actually is the way in which David comported himself that sowed the seeds of his own downfall in a naturalistic and visible and kind of comprehensible way, and very, very tragic, a very tragic way. I'm happy to stay on and answer some more questions or talk a little bit more if anybody would like to. Sorry to leave us on such a sad note, but it's always a pleasure to learn with everyone and to see you, and have a Shavua Tov, everyone.
Thank you. That was very interesting.
We shouldn't name our babies Tamar. That's for sure.
Well, I happen to be a huge fan of Tamar.
It's a nice name.
I'm like a big fan. If you actually want to read more about Tamar, I'll just do a quick plug. There's a great cookbook called Feeding Women of the Bible, Feeding Ourselves. And I wrote a little piece in there about Tamar. You should buy the cookbook. It's great, vegan, plant-based recipes. But I'm a big fan of Tamar. And maybe we give the opportunity to like have really empowered daughters named Tamar who can take back that name and find their voice and speak in her voice. And maybe we can like
that story is very. That's
Avshalom named his daughter Tamar.
Tamar
Avshalom had 3 sons and 1 daughter, and he named his daughter Tamar.
I love that. I did not know that. Thank you for
telling
me that.
Situation.
You know, that story is very relevant in today's world. This is really up front. It's in the newspapers. I mean, you really feel that story now.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hi, Marilyn.
Which is tragic.
What you said before, I wrote that above when it just says David's name. It doesn't say Melech David.
Mm-hmm.
He was being the David who went after Bathsheba, and he kind of set a really bad example.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah.
You said privileged, and you know, but to me the whole thing. I mean, I'm not a feminist that way, but it tells you that women were a decorative chattel. It's you know, if you lust after someone, especially if you're the king, you can do what you want. And his son did more or less the same.
Right. So I think what you're saying is true in terms of reflecting the reality of the situation. And I think that the way all of those stories are written in the text make it very, very clear that from an ethical, the message that the writing of the Tanakh is trying to give us about that attitude is that is a wrong attitude to have. And I think that's specifically clear from the stories. Yes.
But there's no closure really. It's really it's very disturbing.
Life.
But you know, it turns the first Tamar story on its head. The story with Yehuda, where she was the one who was right. There was a similar kind of thing, but she was the one who came out on top.
Right. Well, I think that's interesting because in that story, the scene that's the ultimate kind of like climax of that is Yehuda being able to listen to Tamar and say, "You're right," and like listen to what she has to
Exactly.
say. And in this story, the story repeatedly shuts down this Tamar's voice. And I think that's a very profound commentary on listening to the voices of women who are saying things about their experience.
Right.
Yeah.
But as you said, it's the family of the king. They think they're privileged. They can do what they want.
Yeah, I don't know, Allie. You might be a feminist.
I'm not really, but in that sense, because the Torah is actually, I think it's some of the actors in the Torah. The Torah is really not anti-women. If you see the responsibilities, I mean, there are certain things, but I think it's the culture. It's the whole Middle East. I mean, look at the whole Middle East.
Yeah, I hear that. It's a definite one way of thinking about it.
Well, I've had to be a feminist. I had to fight for everything.
There you go.
Okay, thanks a lot. It was very interesting.
Thank you very much. Yes, we go on.
Good night, Ova.
Thank you.
Question.
Yes.
Did you send this out? Because I couldn't find it.
The source sheet? We did send it out. I could send it to you either. Is email better for you, Marilyn? Or do you want me to post it in the chat?
No, send email.
I'll email it to you. Yeah, absolutely.
Don't seem to find these things.
Sorry.
Cora,
Technical support hotline.
Cora,
Yes.
hi. It was excellent.
Thank you.
So I just sent a question in the chat. Do you think that David was complicit? Because it kind of seems like he knew what was going to happen. It's very puzzling.
So if you're asking my opinion, I think people make different kinds of arguments about this. I don't think so. I think he really didn't know. Maybe he should have known what was going on. I don't the reason why is because he is very upset at the end of the story. And I don't know. I just don't get the sense that he knew. I think that what's pretty tragic is that he participates in it. But my gut tells me he didn't know. But I could just I could be wrong.
I wrote that on top. I'm surprised he didn't catch on.
It's hard. I mean, but then again, part of what's so troubling about incest is that it's the opposite of what you would expect, right? Like our whole societal structure has no, you don't guess that these kinds of things are going to happen. We have assumptions about familial relationships. Because they're familial relationships, we treat siblings with each other differently than we treat any other kind of pairings. So I think it's a hard thing to guess. Nobody, I just don't think that it crosses most people's minds, especially with the way that David says, go to your brother, you or his sister, go to your brother's house. I just don't think that anyone would intentionally. I don't know. I could be wrong. Maybe I just have too much faith in David. I don't think he knew. That's my opinion. Oh, Miriam, really interesting. Yaakov did send Yosef. That's awesome. Yaakov sent Yosef to his brothers and put him in the situation. I don't think, right? I doubt Yosef was probably they're going to kill him, right? But he did in some way participate in bringing them together in the same way that David did. Wow, that's awesome. So interesting. Thanks, Miriam.
It almost seems like David should have known and might have just been sort of in some kind of denial. But it seems from the language of the way he asked him, specifically for her to come, and in the way in which he asked her to come, it just feels like he should have known there was something a little strange about it. I don't know.
No, it's creepy. We talked about the specific things in the way Amnon asks that are a little weird.
Right.
So maybe.
It just seems like David should have picked up on something strange. and almost maybe was kind of like in some kind of denial.
Or is like just not present enough with his children. Like that's also definitely a possibility. Marilyn, yes. Wait, Howard Blank. Hello. If you email me, I can send you a recording of this shear. In fact, I'm going to stop recording it because nobody needs.
Or can I make one comment?
Please.
It's Bernie Ford.